Okay, that's a big word in there, isn't it? Acknowledge. Acknowledge. We have to learn that word over the next 3 weeks. Acknowledge him, he shall direct thy paths. So, how many of you have ever had somebody promise you something? I know this happens to me every December. Promising something, and then you have to wait for it. Have you ever had somebody promise you something and then you had to wait for it? How many had to wait for a long time? Okay. Have you ever had to wait for so long that you thought maybe they forgot that they promised it to you? Okay. Can you remember what that was? Can you tell me what it was that who promised you and then you thought that they even forgot that they promised you something? Jeremiah?
Somebody promised me, and somebody's good.
Okay. Alright. Stephen?
My dad promised me.
What did he promise you?
He said he was going to put the living room TV in my room, but then he didn't.
Has it happened yet?
No.
So you're still waiting.
No, he put it in now.
Oh, okay. So, we have people promise us something, and then we have to wait for it. Do you remember what God promised David? Remember what God promised David? God told David that someday he would be the king. Okay, so God promised David he would be the king. Very good. Do you remember what David was doing when God promised him, when God told him he would be the king? What was David doing? Remember where he was when they had to go and find him?
In the cave.
He was not in the cave.
He was
He wasn't in bed.
He was taking care of his sheep.
He was taking care of the sheep. That's right. He was out taking care of the sheep. And we don't know exactly, but we think that David was about 16 years old, somewhere around there, when God promised him that he would be the next king. Do we have anybody here that's 16 years old? Ian is 16. Anybody 15? 15? 14? 14, okay. So, can you imagine how many of you are, 16 or 17 years old and God says, you're going to be the next king. You think you're ready to be the king?
No.
No. David was not ready to be king. Who was the king?
Saul.
Who was the king when God told David that he would be the next king?
Saul.
Saul. So, David didn't go and kill Saul right away and say, well, you're not going to be king anymore. I'm going to be the king. Did he?
No.
No. Did David have any chances to speed things up?
No.
Did he have any chances to just get rid of Saul so that he could be the next king?
No. Yes.
He did. He did. Do you remember one of them?
Yeah.
You were shaking your hands like yes, your head, but you don't remember what it was. Who remembers one of those times when David could have killed Saul and then he'd be the next king, but he didn't? Cody? When he played his harp for Saul? Well, that was Saul, and then Saul kind of threw the javelin at David. He's not going to kill him with a harp, beat him over the head with his harp. What was the time when David had a chance to kill Saul and he didn't? Do you remember, Stephen?
When he was surrounded in the cave.
When he was in the cave, that's right. Saul was surrounded in the cave. He didn't even know it. He went in there and he took a nap, but he was surrounded by David and all of David's friends, his army. And they said, now's your chance. But David did not kill him. What did David do to Saul when he was in the cave? Remember what he did? He cut something. Remember what he cut?
He had the sword.
The sword. That was the other time.
He cut his robe.
He cut his robe. What was the other time? David had a chance to kill Saul. He was sleeping again, right? The whole army was sleeping. They were sleeping very deeply. And in their base, they were in the army base, in the camp, and they were sleeping really hard because not even anybody saw David and his cousin when they came in. And what did they take from Saul that time? They took his spear and his jug of water. So, David is waiting, right? God said, you're going to be the king, but he's not the king. He's waiting. And he is not taking his own opportunities to be the king. He's waiting for who to make him the king? He's waiting for God. He's waiting for God to work it out. Because he could have worked it out himself, couldn't he?
Yeah.
But he didn't. Now David had to run and hide from Saul for many years. Many years. In fact, the Bible says that about the time that David was 30. Now, some of you are older. So how many years had David been waiting when he was 30 years old? How many years? Close. Cody? About 14 years. 13, 14 years he's been waiting. And about 13, 14 years he's been waiting. He's 30 years old. And at this point, he's been running from Saul. And he and his army, which he had 600 men who were fighters. He had a small army of 600 men, plus their wives and their children that were following him. And they were living in this town right here called Ziklag. Now, I need somebody to tell me, looking at the map, what country, see if you can read, what country is the town of Ziklag in? Can you read what country that is? It's not a word that we use all the time right now. Can you tell what country the town of Ziklag is in? Let's try. Do you know what country the town of Ziklag is in? Philistia. Who lives in Philistia? The Philistines. That's right. And who's the most famous Philistine of all?
The giant.
The giant Goliath. That's right. But now, and David killed Goliath, but now David and his army are living in this town in the country of Philistia, trying to stay safe, trying to stay away from Saul and his army. And he's 30 years old, he's been waiting. And one day, they were there, lots of things happened. We can't tell you about everything that the Bible tells us happened to David. But one day he was there in the town, and a man came running into town, and he had some of his clothes torn, and he had dirt on his head. Well, in those days, that meant that somebody important had died. And so this man came up to David, and he fell down on his knees, and he bowed down before him. He had his clothes torn, and had dirt on his head, and David said, "What are you doing? Why are you acting this way?" And he says, "I just came from Saul's army, and the Philistines have beaten the army, and they have killed Saul and Jonathan. Here is Saul's crown and his bracelet from his arm as proof that Saul had died." Now is David's chance to be the king, right? No one else is in place. Saul was keeping him from being king. Now he has nothing else in his way. Was David happy now? You think David was happy?
No.
He was not happy. We heard about this last week, didn't we?
Everyone died.
Why was David sad when he heard that Saul and Jonathan were killed? Stephen?
Because David liked Saul, even if Saul hated David.
Hated him. Okay, that's close. David respected Saul. Who had chosen Saul to be the king?
Jesus.
God. God had chosen Saul to be the king, and then Saul disobeyed, and God said, Saul, you're not going to be king anymore. I've chosen somebody else to be king. Do you remember how God described the man that he was going to choose to be king? He said, I'm going to choose a man after my own heart. That's right. So he was going to choose a man after my own heart, and that's when he chose David. But David's waiting now 13, 14 years, and now Saul has died. But David never attacked Saul himself because God had chosen Saul. God had anointed Saul. Why was David sad when he heard that Jonathan died? Remember, Jonathan was Saul's son. Cody? They were best friends. They loved each other. They loved each other's families. They were the best of friends. They had promised, right? They had promised that they would always help each other's family, whatever happened. So David and all of his men, they cried and they mourned and they didn't do anything for the whole day. They were very upset. Also, they were upset because the children of Israel had been beaten by their enemies. Now, David was a man after God's own heart. So you think David just went and did whatever he wanted to do?
No.
He probably thought, okay, Saul is dead. Now it's my turn. I'll just go and do something. In fact, in those days, if you became the king and it wasn't your dad, actually some guys, believe it or not, later on we read in the Bible about some sons who became king and they killed their own brothers because they didn't want those brothers coming after them to be king. But if it wasn't, if you became king after somebody who wasn't even in your family, lots of kings, they would find the rest of all the relatives and they would go kill all the other relatives so they wouldn't come after your kingdom and say, you're not supposed to be king, I'm supposed to be king. You think David did that?
Nope.
No, David did not do that. David asked God, he said, God, should I go up into Judea, or into Judah? So he's in Ziklag, which is in Philistia, right? And so he goes to God and says, should I go up into Judah? And God said, yes. Okay, so David decides, okay, I'm going to go up into Judah. Now, in the land of Judah, in the state, we might say, of Judah, was two tribes of Israel. Judah and Simeon lived there. And David said, what town in... Let's stop playing with the marshmallow. What town should I go to? And God said, go to the city of Hebron. So he and his wives and his men and their wives, they all moved from Ziklag up to Hebron, and they lived there. And the people of Judah came to David and said, we want you to be our king. So all the people that lived in Judah was two tribes of Israel and some of the Levites. So how many tribes of Israel didn't come to David and say, we want you to be our king? How many tribes of Israel are there? Remember? How many tribes, how many sons of Jacob were there? 12. So if Judah and Simeon said, we want you to be our king, how many didn't say they wanted him to be the king? 10, right? So David is in Hebron, and he is king over Judah. But there was another son of Saul, and some other people thought, well, Saul's son should be the king. And so His name was Ishbosheth. We don't need to remember that, but Ishbosheth was king over the rest of Israel for 7 more years. Okay, math problem. After 7 years, Ishbosheth died, and then the rest of the men of Israel all came to David and said, David, you, even when Saul was our king, you led our armies out and defeated the Philistines and conquered them. You are the one that God has said should be our king. We want you to be our king. So, David became the king of all of Israel 7 years after he was the king over Judah. Now, math problem. How many years from the time that God said to David, you will be the next king over Israel, until he actually was the king over all of Israel? How many years? Cody?
21.
20, 21, 22. We don't know exactly. But, yeah, 20 years. Can you imagine waiting 20 years for something that somebody promised you? It's hard enough waiting from Thanksgiving until Christmas to open my Christmas present, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
But 20 years. Could you imagine if somebody said to you, Stephen, I'm going to give you something. I'm going to make you very, very rich, but you're going to have to wait for 20 years. God didn't even say how long, but it ended up being 20 years. But does God keep his promises?
Yes.
He does.
Yep.
We can always trust God. Sometimes human beings make a promise and then we don't have the ability to keep our own promise. We mean to do well, but then we can't. But God, whatever it is he promises, we know that he will keep his promise, and he kept his promise to David. David became the king. Now there's 3 things that David did. There's lots of things, but 3 things I want to tell you about that David did after he became the king, and they all start with a C. Now some of them are words that we don't always use with a C, but that helps me remember. The first has to do with the capital. Do you know what the capital of the United States of America is? What is the capital city of the United States of America? Do you know what the capital city is? Oh, come on. We should know where our capital city is. The president lives in the capital city. Stephen?
He lives in the White House.
In the White House, and the White House is in what city? Washington, D.C. That's right. Do you know what the capital of the state of Indiana is? Indianapolis. That's right. Okay, so states and countries have a capital city. And David, when he became the king, he said, we need to get all of our enemies out. Now, they had just lost to the Philistines, right? So they had to drive the Philistines out. And he said, I want to conquer the people and drive the heathen out of the land, of the city of Jerusalem. So this is Jerusalem. And at that time, it was not, Israelites did not live there. Jerusalem was a city on the border between Judah and all the rest of Israel. And so he said, let's drive our enemies out of Jerusalem. And they did that. And then David moved all the government, all the important people of the country to Jerusalem. And he said, Jerusalem is going to be our capital city. Another thing that he did is that he said we should move the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Now, if you've been coming faithfully, you might remember where the Ark of the Covenant was. Where is the Ark of the Covenant when David wanted to move it to Jerusalem? This might be a tricky question unless you've been paying attention. Let's see if Cody has been paying attention. Where was the Ark of the Covenant? It was in somebody's house, wasn't it? And somebody said, where should it have been? It should have been in the tabernacle. The tabernacle is in a town that was up in Gilboa, up this way. But the tent, the Ark of the Covenant, was not in the tabernacle. It was in somebody's house. And David said, we should bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And he did. They brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. It was a fantastic time. Everybody was rejoicing. They built a special tent for it there. And so they could worship God where the Ark of the Covenant was, but they had to go up to the tabernacle where the altar was, where the bronze altar was, and all of that to do those special ceremonies. But, so he moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and then he built himself a big house. Other kings were happy for him, and they sent him big, huge trees and boards of wood. He built himself a magnificent house. What kind of house does a king live in? What do we call the king's house? We call it starts with a P, right? A palace. That's right. So David built himself a big house. He's living in his palace, and he's sitting there one day, and he thought, God has been so good to me. He has allowed me and our people to defeat all of our enemies. And he's allowed me to build this beautiful house. I have a wonderful house to live in. But the Ark of the Covenant, it sits in a tent still. What do you think is going through David's mind? I live in a house, but the Ark of the Covenant sits in a tent. What do you think David is going to think? That the ark should go in his house? Well, that's an idea, but that wasn't his idea. David thought, I want to build a house for God. I want to build a special house for God, a temple, so that the Ark of the Covenant doesn't have to sit under a tent. It can have a magnificent house. And he talked to one of the good men that was one of his advisors, Nathan the prophet. And he said to Nathan the prophet, I've been thinking, I want to build, God has let me live in this big house. I want to build a beautiful house, a temple for God, for the Ark of the Covenant, and all the worship of God to take place in the temple, and I'll build it here in Jerusalem. And Nathan said, that's a good idea. God has blessed you and everything else you've done. You should do that. And Nathan went home that night, and as he was sleeping, he was a prophet, so God could talk directly to him. Listen, and God talked to Nathan the prophet and said, Nathan, I want you to go back to David and tell him that I have been with him ever since he was watching the sheep, and I have blessed him, but I do not want him to make me a house. I've never lived in a house. I've always had a tent for my tabernacle. And tell him these other things too. So Nathan went to David and said, David, God came to me last night and said he doesn't want you to build him a house. He's going to let your son build him a house. Oh. So what's God promising David? He says, your son is going to build me a house. That means his son is going to be the king. Was David's father the king? No. But David's son is going to be king. And Nathan told David, and David, God says, he is going to bless your son, and if your son will follow him like you have followed him, he will bless him. If your son does not follow him like other kings, he will punish him, but he will never take the throne of Israel away from one of your sons or grandsons. So God is saying, I'm going to, in the language of the Bible, it says, I'm going to make you a house. And that meant I'm going to make you a dynasty. Do you know what a dynasty is? That's where one king, his son is king, and then his son is king. And does God keep that promise? Do you know who the king in Jerusalem is today? If it's forever, that would mean until today, right? Is there a king in Jerusalem right now?
No.
Is there a son or a grandchild or a great-grandchild of David that is a king today? Are you saying yes? No, you're just gulping? This is not a trick question. I'm going to make you think. Yes, there is. Who is the son of David who is the king today? Stephen? Okay? Stephen was maybe going to say something instead of answering my question.
You want me like say David's
I want the
son?
name of David's grandson who is the king today.
His name is. Is it Saul?
No, Saul was the other king. Do you know that the Bible tells us that Jesus was the son of David, doesn't it? Jesus was born in Bethlehem because he was of the house and ancestry of David. Jesus, the blind man, I was reading about this earlier this week, the blind man came to him and said, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And so, Jesus is David's son, and is Jesus king? He is king. He's not on the earth right now, but when Jesus comes back to the earth, he will conquer all of his enemies, and he will sit on the throne of David and rule the world from the throne of David. When do you think that's going to happen? Do you think it will be a long time? It might be. But who promised it? God did. So will it happen?
Yes.
Yes, it will. So that is the second thing that I'm telling you about David and his kingdom. The first is that he moved the capital. The second is that God made a covenant, which is an agreement with David. And the third, I want to tell you about David's compassion. Stephen, let me tell us all one more thing about David as the king, and that is that he was compassionate. Now, compassionate means that David cared about people. David was going through his palace, and he was thinking about how God had blessed him, and often he would think, I never had such a good friend as Jonathan, right? Jonathan was his best friend. Even after, when Jonathan died, there was nobody that took the place of Jonathan. Jonathan was such a great friend. And what did he promise Jonathan? He had promised Jonathan that he would always help his family. And so David began to think, I wonder if any of Jonathan's children are alive. Right?
Yeah.
So Jonathan died in the battle, right? Yeah. And Saul died in the battle, and Jonathan's two brothers died in the battle, and then Ishbosheth, he was king for a little while, and he died. So David said, I want us to find out, is there any of Jonathan's children that are still alive? And so people went searching out, and they found out that there was somebody that was one of Jonathan's children that was alive, and his name was Mephibosheth. See if you can say that with me. Mephibosheth. Say it again. Mephibosheth. That's hard to say. Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, so when Saul was killed, all of the house in battle, all of his housekeepers, the maids and everything, they were scared to death that the Philistines were going to kill all of them. And so they grabbed up everything they could and they went running and hiding. And the lady that was taking care of Mephibosheth for Jonathan, he was out in battle, grabbed Mephibosheth. He was only maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, and grabbed him to carry him off. And I don't know what happened. Maybe she tripped. Maybe something happened, but she fell and she dropped Mephibosheth. And when Mephibosheth was dropped, both of his legs became lame. He probably broke his legs and then they healed crooked or something like that. And so Mephibosheth could not walk normally. He was lame. So if you're lame, you can't do much work, can you? Well, David said, I want Mephibosheth to come to me in the palace. So some messenger from David came to Mephibosheth's house and said, the king wants you to meet him. What do you think Mephibosheth was thinking when he heard that the king wanted to see him? What do you think? What did kings normally do think Mephibosheth was a little scared that David was going to eliminate him too? Yeah, maybe somehow he didn't know that about David's promise, or maybe he thought David was like a lot of other people that make promises and don't keep them. Right? But Mephibosheth came. When the king calls, you come. And Mephibosheth came to King David, and King David said, I don't want you to be afraid of anything, Mephibosheth. I'm so glad to see and that you are alive. I am going to make sure that all of your grandfather's land, King Saul, all of your grandfather's land is given back to you and your family. And your grandfather's servant, the man that took care of the land before when he was alive, Ziba is his name, he is going to take care of your land. He's going to farm it and get everything from it and take care of it for you. And you, I want you to eat in my palace every day for the rest of your life. Well, that is compassion, isn't it? That is kindness. Did Mephibosheth deserve to have the kindness of David? Why was David kind to Mephibosheth? Because of himself? Why was David kind to Mephibosheth? Ian?
Because he's part of God. Because God is
Because David's a good man, but why in particular? Whose father was Mephibosheth? Who was Mephibosheth's father? Kaylee? Jonathan. That's right. So David was kind to Mephibosheth because of Jonathan. Right? Because Jonathan was his father. And that's a picture for us too. I need to stop, but I want to tell you one more thing. God does not have to be kind to us. It's in his nature to be kind, but it's also in his nature to be just and to punish evil. And it doesn't have to be kind to us. But those that believe on Jesus, he is kind to, isn't he? Is he kind to us because we deserve it? No. He's kind to us because he loves his Son, Jesus Christ. If you've never trusted on Jesus, you can't expect the kindness of God. God's goodness calls everyone to repent and believe on Jesus, but those that have believed on Jesus become Jesus' brothers, and they then receive God's kindness.